God bless my speaking and our listening. Amen. She got a memory that she never knew she had. Did you come across this story this week? This woman is Tracy Scott. She was contacted by some friends who noticed online that some of the medals and mementos, pictures of her family, were being trotted out on the internet looking for where they belonged. She said she turned to those stories, and there at once, staring back at her, were her mother and her grandfather and her grandmother. A grandfather that she had never known. She said this: I saw there's a story about Robert Finch's medals being donated, so I went to the story and saw my grandmother, my grandfather, and my mother staring back at me. It was a wonderful thing to see her go into this Goodwill store, and bless the staff there, because when they received these pictures and medals, they knew that wasn't something that rightfully belonged to them and shouldn't be sold out of a Goodwill store. And they put that out on the internet, and they found her. And she came that day, and the cameras were there, and she recovered these memories of hers. And her hand was shaking with emotion as she picked up these photographs that she had never seen and didn't know existed, and yet were part of her story. Our memories are important to us. Out of all the events of your life, you probably have 2 or 3 or a handful of places and relationships and moments that you go to when you remember who you are. Those life-shaping, life-framing events which, especially in moments of crisis and moments of confusion, you probably return to and say, ah, yes, that's who I am. I remember now. It's important to remember. What are the life-shaping memories of your life? Where do you go? Lately, we've been talking a lot about recovering lost memories and lost voices. Voices that have been silenced and memories that may have been silenced by culture and power and a false imposition of shame upon us. And it's a wonderful thing and a healing thing and a thing for our dignity when we are allowed to reclaim these memories for our life. Not to remember them with shame, but to remember them as things we have survived and overcome, and remember the dignity of people that we have silenced. And when we remember them, they become part of the fabric of our lives and history and part of our strength. On November the 8th, we celebrated Indigenous Veterans Day. As we remember the stories of the residential schools, we also remember the stories of those who served us, our Indigenous peoples. We are stronger for that. We are stronger when we remember. Yesterday was an important memory in the history of our world. It was the day that the Berlin Wall came down 30 years ago. Can you imagine that? It was a great celebration in Germany yesterday, but also a time of sorrowful remembering those who died trying to escape to the West. But indeed, it was also a part of our own history. Because yesterday also marked another day in Germany. In 1938, day known, or night known as Kristallnacht, the night of breaking glass, when the Nazi terror that was to be showed its ugly head and reared up to break the glasses of Jewish businesses, to go in and ransack and burn 267 synagogues in Berlin. If we are to hold the day the Berlin Wall fell as a day of the victory of freedom, we also have to hold this day in our memory as also part of the legacy of our Western family. Both those days are important as part of our responsibility, part of our family staring back at us, in order that we might go forward in true freedom. I don't know if you remember the story, and I guess your sound is off here, of Saving Private Ryan. Made in 1998 of the interesting American story of a family where three brothers were understood as having been killed. They were the Nealon brothers, and this is James Ryan. And there was a group of soldiers detached to find the surviving brother that he might be returned safely to his mother. Tom Hanks was the captain in question. In the actual story, it was a chaplain in the U.S. Armed Forces who was part of that search group. And they found him. And in this scene, the scene where the captain dies, having found the man he was to redeem, that man leans toward the captain's ear, and Tom Hanks, playing Captain Miller, whispers into his ear, "Earn this. Earn this." We remember November 11th. I'm glad to see that more and more Canadians are remembering it. There was a time when Remembrance Day began to fade almost into irrelevance, somewhat like some say the church is fading into irrelevance. But when we remember, when we're smart, we bring these things back into the shaping memories of our lives. And the recent statistic said that 41% of Canadians are going to take part in Remembrance Day services tomorrow, which isn't bad. It could be better. Because when we forget this, we forget a part of our family history. We forget the value of our lives. You know, that happens in our lives. I'm going to save that for 10 o'clock. The story of Job. And Job is someone who has suffered great affliction. His friends come and tell him he should remember what he did wrong. They're wonderful friends. Job says, "I know I've done nothing wrong." And I like the spin on this text that is given by Handel and Jennings in the Messiah, and really by Christians before them. When Job declares, "I know that my Redeemer liveth," he's saying, look, I don't care what you say. I know what I know, and I also know and remember that there is one who's going to stand for me. Christians for all time since the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ have understood that Redeemer as their Savior. It's good to remember that. I have a dear friend who ministers in Connecticut. We were with her in Israel, and she has shared with a group of us who were with her there the story of a member of her congregation who has left a deep impression upon her. His name is Eric. Eric is an amazing person. He had a life which really was the American dream. He went to Dartmouth and Stanford, earning graduate degrees. He went to New York City and became the manager of a hedge fund on Wall Street. He bought a huge house and had a beautiful wife and 4 children in the most expensive suburb in the United States. And then at 50, he was struck with early onset Parkinson's. And it was the kind of Parkinson's has many different types, and this was a kind that advanced rapidly and was quite virulent. He became crippled. He had implants put into his brain in order that he could still have some mobility, but his speech is slurred. It's hard to understand him. But Eric has become a pillar of that congregation. He says he attends every worship service. They have 2 services a day. He goes to both of them. They have Bible studies. He goes to all of them. He takes part in every event. Eric said before in his life, everything was crowding out his relationship with God. And now every day, he gets closer to God and happier. Somehow, losing everything allowed him to remember who he was. It's good to remember. These crosses, row on row, are our family history staring back at us. But they remind me of another row of crosses. These not in Flanders fields, these on a hill outside of Jerusalem. And in their middle, the cross, the one from which all those other crosses descend and take their meaning and their hope. A symbol not of cruelty and execution, but of the readiness of love to do everything for you and our risen hope. These crosses and this cross is part of your history. Let it become part of the defining memories of your life. Let it be one of that handful to which you go when you are confused or frightened or proud, to remember who you are. For they are the truth about you. This is your story. This is how much you are loved. And it's worth remembering. Amen. So I guess this is our discussion time, and I don't know if we're okay. So do you have a defining memory? Do you have one that leaps to mind? Something that you cherish, that you go to? Annalie?
At this time of the year in particular, I think we all think of our parents.
Wait till I give you the mic.
Oh, okay, thank you. I think we all think of loved ones that we know who were touched by the war in one way or another. And I think for people my generation, a lot of us would say that our parents wouldn't speak to us about it. My dad never talked about his experience in the war till much, much later, probably in his 80s. But one defining moment I do remember from my dad was when we went away on an Alpha retreat, and he and I wandered in. We were supposed to go off on our own. Everybody was supposed to go off on their own. And my dad came up to me and said, "So where will we go, dear?" So we went together. And we ended up in the prayer maze, I think it's called. And I sat with Dad, and we, for the first time, really, really talked about God and his life and through the war. And he told me how he had no fears whatsoever because he knew where he was going. And he would have been probably about 85, 86 at that point. But he was clear and he was strong. And it's a totally defining moment in my life to know that my dad, my earthly father, felt such strength in his heavenly Father.
Beautiful. And her dad and my dad were in the same Air Force squadron.
Well, I'll share a memory that I have, similar to what you said. My father, who lied about his age to get into the war and to serve, at age 16 in World War II. His older brothers had gone, and he felt it was his duty to go as well. His mother was away. His father had died when he was younger, and his mother was away. So at the recruiting office, they couldn't check his age. But they said, "We will check with your mother when she gets home." Of course, they didn't. And he went and served. He served in the Merchant Marine, and if you know what the Merchant Marine did, they were the supply ships in the North Atlantic. And at age 16, to be put as the commander of the watch. Imagine that responsibility as you accompany the troops across and all the supplies. He never told us about his stories, what he saw, and so forth. Until later on, we were living in the States, and my oldest brother was eligible for the draft into the U.S. Army because they were fighting, the U.S. was fighting the conflict in Vietnam. My father sat us down as a family and said, "There is no way that my son will serve and ever see what I saw." So we said, "Dad, what did you see?" Because he had never talked about his war experience. We just heard about the offshore leaves and the party times and that sort of stuff as a 16, 17, 18-year-old. And he told us there were times when they would shoot and whatever they did, depth charges with the German boats, and they would have to pick the dead out of the ocean. He said, "I would never want my sons to have to live through that. War is horrendous. We need to live for peace."
It's good to recall those memories. Anybody else? It doesn't have to be a wartime memory. So,
Just over here first.
When I was a little girl, my mother would tell me stories about the war. She was in Italy, near Monte Cassino, just south of Rome. And the war had been stopped there for, I don't know, a very, very long time. And the Germans were situated in our city, which was Solna. And they somehow found out my grandmother was a fabulous cook. And they would come regularly to the house. And they told us another story of they saved an American and a British officer in the night. They were in the attic when my grandparents were entertaining the Germans, but that's another story.
I think I've seen that movie.
But this is actually, yeah, it was, And my mother was just 10 years old at the time, so she remembers vividly being very terrified, because if they found out, the Germans would have destroyed the family. Anyway, the thing that impacted me very, very much, and the reason why, for me, Remembrance Day is not a nice day, is that my mother would tell the story of the German officers, soldiers that accompanied the officers to the house, and that they would go to my grandmother and my great-grandmother and hug them, and say, tomorrow I have to go to the front, and I may never see my parents, I may never see my mother or my grandmother. And that impacted me. I can never watch a war movie and see the Nazis as terrible people, because it's the young men that sacrificed their lives. They had no choice. And I think that is extremely sad. And I don't think, it scares me that we seem to glorify war in some cases without similar pain.
And that's why we have to remember those stories, because that tells us that there's a cost here that we have to remember. And I always distinguish between the Nazis and the common German soldier.
Well, just a story about kind of paying it forward. So my father was in the war as well. He, as Don Lee said, never talked about the war. So when he had Alzheimer's and we had to move him into Sunnybrook, we went through his things and we found some old pictures of his when he was in the war. And incredible pictures. So he was in the Air Force, and he was essentially on camp. And there's pictures of him standing in the wing of one of the planes he was working on, and with all his buddies. So we got these pictures blown up at Sunnybrook and had him sign these to our children and says, you know, to David Love Ramps. And now those pictures are so important to them as a memory of, you know, obviously remembrance of the bodies when they're out there, what their ranks did.
It's like Tracy Scott suddenly getting a memory she never knew she had. Beautiful.
I have some memories that actually I wish I didn't have, because I grew up in London during the war, on the outskirts of London, and I experienced all the things that happened there. And I listened to the radio and to Churchill, that's no television then, of course, and you heard how many kids were missing when they came home. And my father had a village business. So of course when the war started, that was all commandeered. And the petrol was coloured red so that no ordinary cars could use it, because everybody was rationed. And so my father and his partner went and made all the concrete for the runways in Cambridgeshire and Huntingdonshire. And then the Lancasters almost took off from there and bombed the ramps, I guess, in France. The toolbox, and the landmines that came over were being, sent from. So though he didn't actually serve, at that age in the forces, he helped, in many ways. And of course, in the war, we were near a park, and there they put in a big barrage balloon and balloons up to catch the planes and guns. And so all the men on each street had to wear a hard hat, and they became an air raid personnel. So they would, once a week, they would take turns to go out in the night and tell everybody there was a chink in the blackout curtains. They were all rubberized, so there was not a chink of light. And then they would help if there was a bomb on the street, or and you could hear the shrapnel from the shells raining down. So those are some, what do you do when you have memories that you don't really want to keep.
I think those are valuable memories to share with us, to remind us everyone was involved in that war. And I think it's interesting, your dad laid runways and your son later flew planes
Yes,
in the
and
kitchen.
here he was 3 times to Iraq.
Yeah, 3
which
times
was
to
very hard
Iraq.
to take. And you know, he was a commercial airline pilot before that.
That reminds us of the cost, Barbara, and it's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that story. And Marjorie, did you?
Okay.
And maybe it's just to
I just wanted to share that our granddaughter was so inspired by a teacher that she had in her years of high school and a subsequent trip that was offered to France to visit all the sites of the Canadian and Normandy and so on, that she's gone on to history in university, and who knows where the future will be, but that was an inspiration.
Thanks, Marjorie. And it's so often in my life, it's been teachers that I can recall for those handful of moments that have shaped who I am.